Lavender Menace Bookshop was the first queer bookshop in Scotland. We didn't call it that then. We called it a lesbian and gay bookshop. It was at 11A 4th Street, down a very slippy stair in a long and narrow space. And we weren't sure what the legal situation was because law reform in Scotland had only happened 2 years earlier when we opened in 1982. Bob and I were the partners. We attracted a lot of volunteers to run the shop, and as time went on, we were secure enough to employ them. In 1987, I left and Raymond Rose became the other partner, and the shop moved to Dundas Street. It had a beautiful glass window. It didn't have a shutter on the glass window. That's how secure we felt. It was a great big space with hand-painted marbled shelves, and West and Wild stayed open until 1997, when there was what you might call a worldwide recession in the queer book trades. Even the big shops in America closed, the publishers closed, and it looked as if the whole thing had just been and gone. And then 15 years went by, and suddenly indie bookshops began to be fashionable again. People decided they missed them. And the first queer bookshop in Scotland after us opened 5 years ago in Glasgow. Category is bookshop. I hope you all rush over there at the first possible opportunity if you haven't before. And meanwhile, James Lay wrote a play about us called Love Song to Lavender Menace. Bob and I were asked to do book stalls, then we were asked to do talks. We went to LGBT Youth Scotland, and they had a whole collection of books like these, and they had disappeared. Nobody knew what they were. The young people that we spoke to at LGBT Youth, I had never heard of them, and we realized that if somebody didn't do something, that whole time and the stories that went with the books would disappear. So we started to collect them ourselves because nobody else wanted them. And that was then. This is now. We have 2,300 books, most of them donated by people who, like us, don't want to see them fade away. We're keeping these books for the next generations. Today our guests are Ellen Galford, who is the author of 4 lesbian novels that were published in the 80s and 90s. The first one was the first lesbian novel ever published in Scotland, Moll Cutpurse, Her True History. It's based on history that is not necessarily true. I don't want to disappoint you. And it was published by Stramallion, the first feminist publisher in Scotland. She also wrote The Fires of Bride, which is what we're going to talk about today, and The Dyke and the Dybbuk, and Queendom Come, that's about a dystopian Scotland that has reverted to being a colony, but suddenly forces beyond our ken come to save it. Rachel Plummer is the author of Wayne. It's a book of queer poetry focused on young people, and it queers Scottish legends. And they have also written other things, but I'm not going to give the story away. You may have to be in suspense for a little while. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you. Anyway, my name is Ellen Galford. My accent is very transatlantic, but I've been in Scotland since 1971, apart from a brief deviation down to London for a few years in the 80s. We left about 6 weeks after Thatcher was elected, and then came back well in time for being able to vote for independence and devolution. But came back in the late 80s. So I'm a bit of a mixter-maxter. My accent, taxi drivers always say, "Are you on your way home?" If I'm getting in a taxi to the airport, I say, "No, I'm leaving home." And you sort of feel you want to hand out a card. But anyway, Sigrid and I both go back into what had, in retrospect, was a very, and Bob too, a kind of golden age when you look back on it in some ways, in terms of energy and inspiration, because there was a period when there was really, in the beginning, there was nothing. And suddenly, some things became possible. Sometimes people threw rocks at the somethings, or, attempted, the government people were sent because they didn't like what customs was sending you from the States, where lesbian, we would all just, often the word was just gay then. I mean, it included concepts that now all have names, letters, etc., of our own. But we used to say it was much easier to say to your mother if you were coming out, "Mom, I'm gay." It didn't take as long as saying, "Mom, I'm lesbian," or "Mom, I'm bisexual." You could get it all out in one tiny little syllable. But we had things like customs persecuting bookshops. You had customs troubles. I was down because Lavender Menace opened just as my partner and I moved down to London for a few years, but I used to come back up. I remember doing readings when Moll Cutpurse was published, and there was just a huge kind of energy. There was also, it's looking at it through very rose-colored glasses, because there's infighting now, and there are tribal debates. And there certainly were then. I mean, that seems to be in the nature of when you're trying to reinvent the world. Not everybody is lovely as they're trying to sort of build things up from nothing, or from demolishing something that's sort of persecuting. So, but there was that. Nostalgically, it seemed there was a sense of community. There were conversations, and there were a lot of different weird and wonderful things going on. And certainly without Lavender Menace and that notice board, where if you arrived in town and you had never been to Edinburgh before, somehow places like that, and certainly in West and Wild as well, the notice boards. I think I wrote a story once about some heterosexual people wandering accidentally into West and Wild. And what happened to one of them later when she went back to America, the tourists. But there was a sense of a sort of tribal thing, and I think I'd like to feel that it could still exist or regenerate. There's never a point when people aren't furious to bits at each other, because we all have different visions of revolution and transformation. But I think the great thing about literary culture, about book culture, inside the world of LGBTQI and whatever comes next, in the 20 years from now will be a completely different language, probably. It's such the rich resources of who we are, where we came from, what we didn't want to be, and what we might hope to be. It's just, may the goddesses, gods, invisible forces, and non-existent theologies bless you. Which was my second novel. I had written a couple of short stories. I'd written a short story for a women's press anthology. I think that was my first publication. I think it was called Girls Next Door, and my story was actually about a vision that all of us queer people and all our particular alphabet, it was a dystopian story about that we were all put in camps. And when I think back, and at the time I was writing about it, I thought this was dystopian because it was still there was still a sense of risk and peril. Male, homosexual, male, gay, sex was still illegal then. It was all so many things. Customs was still ripping up books. Parents were still never speaking to their kids again. Well, I suppose that still happens. Excommunication has not become obsolete. But anyway, so then I think I had sent them my second novel, because Stromolian had done Moll Cutpurse, which when I tried to get published first, somebody said, "Oh, there's this very women-friendly feminist agent in London. Why don't you," I met her at a conference, "why don't you send her your books?" And this woman sort of looked at Moll Cutpurse and said, "Well, I think this could work, but it doesn't have enough men in it." And well, actually, there are some men, and she's got this really nice gay playwright friend, and but it took a while for even various publishers not to be very twitchy about things. Anyway, but the Fires of Bride, women's press, which no longer exists, but was part of a big, well-endowed publishing group. I mean, there was a guy named Naim Attallah, who was I think originally Palestinian, Anglo-Palestinian business guy. He had Quartet and a lot of quite serious publishing things going on, and so I think they were fairly well funded to start. So anyway, Sigrid said, "Why don't you?" And of course, I have hardly looked at it since the last century, but you asked me to eke. Yeah, here it is. I think it was a particular section. Oh God. I think you said page 11 or something. I had saved it, but I suddenly realized I may have been looking at a different edition. Oh yeah, no, oh yeah, no. Ah. This is very scary because, oh yeah, here it is. Yeah. Okay. There was a slightly autobiographical beginning to it. I was working at the time at Scottish Television as a researcher, which is kind of the lowest level of the journalistic hierarchy. And where you're sort of the gopher, but you do get to do things like running orders and making the phone calls. We're doing a program on X with zero money, but wouldn't you like to be on it for fame and glory, or to. So anyway, so I was a researcher, and it was. Homophobic was not the word. Sexist, homophobic, you name it. I mean, there were some lovely people, everybody highly intelligent, highly articulate, but this was, I was sort of working there in the sort of mid to late 70s. And so you got sent off places to do some interesting groundwork for programs. We had what we called hit and run documentaries. They were very cheap to make, and they were based on what the news was at that week, and decided on, and you had a really tight shooting ratio, and off you went to try to cram a cord into a pint pot. So anyhow, so I thought, so there is this character who is a researcher. I think she was called Lizzie, was she? Yes. And she's sent off mainly because I think they want to get her away because they want to do something really, really sexist and misogynist. So they think it would be better, because she was a bit of a pain in the neck, because she was one of these women's libbers, which is a phrase you probably, so far in ancient history, it's like you won't remember. But they thought it would be better if she would get her out of the way and get her out to an island, which of course, because fiction is safer if you don't try to make everything, it's like characters that are inspired by truth or something. This was a sort of an island somewhere in, sort of between the Outer Hebrides and the Northern Isles, somewhere out in that direction. So she is sent off, and they say, right, we're sending you out this island. There's a lot of unemployment and alcoholism and heavy-duty Calvinism and all this, and we want you to go out there because we're going to be doing a little documentary on it. So this is about the island of Cailleach, which, forgive me for anybody who is a Gaelic speaker in this room, because my pronunciation of Cailleach, which means the old woman, was also the name of a goddess. It was an old female goddess figure, the Cailleach. And this island is where it comes from. So she says, I do my homework. I think about scenes from the history of Cailleach. But which scenes? Which history? History political. Barefoot parliaments, government by consensus between the crones and the fishermen, thugs taking over an island, flipped back and forth like a tossed coin between the jagged, blood-rimmed fingernails of Picts and Norsemen, Highland chieftains, absentee English milords who came into the title arse backwards. Questions asked in the House, literacy rates, sanitary arrangements, unemployed head of household, the island problem, proposals for reform, good ideas admired and forgotten, like the rotting hulk of the old Dutch herring busk gone aground in South Bay. A policy decision, made in Edinburgh or London, to smack the Gaelic out of the school children for their own good. In election years, candidates come because they're told to, faces going bilgy green from seasickness above the bright-coloured party rosettes. A suggestion that the sole Scottish connection may have been no more than a spelling error by a medieval scribe. And really the whole place belongs to the Norwegians by right. History romantic. Lonely castles guarding rocky coasts, the song of the seabirds, captive princesses, keening pipes, a bard who sings it all from the morning of time, handed down from father's father, or more likely from mother's mother, who never gets the credit. The whole narration in perfect and neatly translatable pentameters, probably a fraud by a whimsical 18th century antiquary. Don't believe a word of it. Ghost stories by the bucketful, curses, possibly a Norse earl stabbed to death with gem-encrusted brooches and buried with his longboat in sight of the seas he conquered. Inscrutably shawled and barefoot maidens crooning, mists and whimsy, and thank goodness not a whisper of the little people. It's cloying enough as it is. History spiritual. When the earth was soft and unformed and warm as kneaded dough, the mother tore a lump of it and pressed and punched and pulled and pounded. Finally forming the island, she lends it the name of one of her spare incarnations, Cailleach, the crone, the old woman, a grey mare or white sow soaring across the sky. The old hag scoops up giant stones in the folds of her apron. tosses or possibly blows them into the sacred circles, cromlechs, dolmens, duns and cairns of the west. Beasts grazing nearby, cows and sheep, always gravitate towards them. What's the pull? But the ungrateful lot who live there light their fires for someone else entirely. Bride, Brigantia, Bridget. The triple goddess who brings them poetry, smithcraft, and the skills of midwifery. Thanks a lot. Put the three together and you can forge a baby, all of bronze, and make it tell rude, rhyming stories. After Bride come Christian monks, the Molowags, Mungos, and Columbas, racing like schoolboys who's to see who makes it first ashore. Whatever their virtues, and they have many, they do find the three-headed lady a hard act to follow. History sexual. Women living closely in groups bleed in unison. In the hot days of summer, the island's breezes are faintly spiced with the scent of it. 2,500 years or more of combinations and couplings, passionate, dutiful, loving, cold, conventional, incomprehensible, and dangerous attractions. Rape as a political statement by raiders, fun for the laird's guest, and a perk for faithful servants. Some furtive attempts with sheep, yes, the jokes are true. Much fantasizing, seeds and juices spelled nightly onto sheets from Nestival to the cliffs of Crunig. The priests come and go, the Protestants take over. Awkward questions in the confessional are replaced by bucketfuls of guilt. From now on, the frissons of secrecy, memories of the night before, flicker behind smooth, bland faces in the Sabbath kirk, whiling away the hours of the sermon.
So I really always want to shout out the Emma Press, which is a small press, and they took this risk. And so I wanted to pay it back to them, that they were the ones, this small press who were maybe in the least position to take a risk, but did it, which is often the way, isn't it? So, I always have to mention them, and they're lovely. And the person who runs it, she's called Emma, and she's really nice. So yeah, this is a book of LGBT reimaginings of Scottish folklore in poems, and I'm just going to read a couple of them so that you get a feel for them. And again, Sigrid asked for one in particular, so I'll start with that one. And there's all sorts of different kind of folklore creatures from all different areas in Scotland and different time periods, and so there's a few different ones, but this one is particularly, it's about the brownie. I can find it now. And we all know brownies, I think, mostly from the brownies and the Girl Guides. And you get it, I was in the brownies. Was in the brownies? Yeah.
I was in the brownies.
Some brownies around, yeah. I mean, you have it kind of drummed into you, the story about the brownie being like the little imp that comes and tidies the house and does all the chores. And like as little girls, we're taught to, you know, that's what we should be like little and quiet and invisible and doing all the chores. So I wanted to write a brownie who, it's very inspired by my own experiences, who isn't really a girl and doesn't really want to keep doing all the chores. So this is Brownie. They called me a girl because I helped round the house. That's just how these human folk think. So I swept and I mopped and I vacuumed the rug while they went out to party and drink. I washed their nice clothes and I polished their shoes and I dusted their flat screen TV. They woke every day to a toilet scrubbed clean and they knew it was all thanks to me. They called me a girl and they nodded and smiled and said, "Brownie, you've done a great job. You're sweet and industrious, small and so neat, not like a great manly old slob. If only more girls were like you," they all said, old-fashioned and knowing their place. Why, think how the world would be bettered by that. Now clean up that sooty fireplace. So I chimney swept, sweated, I wore myself out while they danced in the discos and clubs. But I wasn't a girl, the girl they imagined, who happily washes and scrubs. That's not what a girl is, I said to myself, and neither am I. So why bother? Why work hard all day with no rest and no play when I could give my time to another? I left them a note when I left in the night that said, "Off to my next job, goodbye. I've left you the bleach and the toilet brush too, and I'm sure that you'll cope if you try." I found someone new and I work for them now, and I'm just a much happier elf. Not a girl, as they've known, Now I live on my own, and I only clean up for myself. There's a lot of poems I have in here that deal with Bera, and Bride as well, which are heavily featured in your book, and I love it. I think I wanted to write. I've always loved the stories of Bera and the stories of the hag, and this idea of, this crone who is so cold and distant, but also has this capacity for creation, and definitely isn't that demure girl. She's not on anybody else's terms at all, and she has anger and all that. She's allowed these things. So this is a poem that I wrote about her, and it's called The Story of Snow. This is not the story of Bera, the hag, who hammered out a lock space by Ben Nevis and poured her servant Nessa in. And this is not the story of Nessa, singing from within the water, touching the earth's empty stomach, hiding a kelpie in her skirts. Not a kelpie story, lockweed, wet-hooved, unshod, cringing from iron, bearing a child under the lock to drown and eat. Oh no, this is not the story of a child, taken from the land's arms and sunk like a wish coin into Ely Ness. Or the story of an eel, glassy from the Sargasso, thrusting itself through this mud all winter until it blackens. Not the story of winter. Old Father Winter, come to the loch to wash Bera's grief white fleece and lay it to dry on the mountains. This is not that story at all. This poem is kind of a call and response. So the story of the Blue Men is that they're kind of like a male version of sirens almost, but they're also kind of storm kelpies. They live in the Minch and the Sea, between the kind of north of Scotland and the Hebrides. So they would try and like lure sailing ships and drown them. But in the stories, the Blue Man would say a couple of rhyming lines of poetry to the captain of the ship, and if he could respond wittily enough and quickly enough with 2 good lines back, then maybe the Blue Man would let him safely pass. So this has a kind of call and response between the two. Would you read the
You want me to do the italics?
Is that okay?
Yeah, fine.
Okay, we're going to give this a go. Sea captain, what brings you here to the rough waters out beyond Skye?
Storm kelpie, stirring the sea. We're bound for the islands nearby.
Sea captain, handsome and brave, come dance in the water with me.
Storm kelpie, blue as an eye. I would drown in your storm-roughened sea.
Sea captain, be not afraid. I will bear you up out of the tide.
Storm kelpie, many have danced in your arms, and each of them died.
Sea captain, those are the souls that live with me under the waves.
Storm kelpie, I do not wish to join you with them in their graves.
Sea captain, come take my hand and play shinty with me on the foam.
Storm kelpie, night gathers near, and my ship must return to its home.
Sea captain, I know a home for your ship on the deep sea's bed.
Storm kelpie, only on land will I lay down my sea-weary head.
Sea captain, could you not love me and live with me here in the blue?
Storm kelpie, well I could love, but I cannot remain here with you.
Sea captain, then I must raise up a strong wind to set you free. Know you will find me out here on the Minch if you ever return to the sea.
How did you decide to write about lesbian characters on Hebridean Island, and what you said about how perilous things were back in those days makes that an even more unlikely fantasy? So what do you think brought it to your mind? Was it maybe going there and meeting people, or was it something that came from way back in your mind?
I think part of it came from way back in my mind, because even though I sort of thought I was maybe not as other nice little suburban Jewish American girls were when I was wee, it took me quite some time to be able to kind of come through the period with silence, stereotype. You know, I can't possibly be one of those, you know. I mean, people didn't even know the word lesbian, or if you did, you know, I can't be one of those people because, oh, you know, I mean, I'm not good in gym, and, you know, the only PE, you know, the only lesbians I know are PE teachers, or scary people in movies where they're really sinister and they do the murdering in really nasty ways, you know. So it took me some time. And when, you know, in spite of hanging out in scenes, mainly with gay men, and I think, and some people who define themselves as drag queens now, I do not know if these people, if they were still alive, which I don't think any of them are anymore, would now define themselves as trans or what. But there were a lot of really fabulous and interesting New York people. And yet it took me well into, what am I? You know, the term bisexual was coming around. No, that wasn't going to do it either. And I came to Scotland, I kind of falling in love with Scotland, where I had been briefly for a sort of summer course when I was an undergraduate, coming here to live, and it was the time when I guess I liberated myself from the fact of, you know, you're in New York City and you can live wild, but your mother's just 20 miles away out in New Jersey. You know, it's not, somehow I had to do what a lot of us did in those days, go as far as you can, even from parents you love, or people or families you love. It was a kind of, I think my theory was, we used to call it queer transhumance, you know, that you had to kind of do migration to get to the point where you could relax and breathe. And Scotland, absolutely, I loved it. I'd been on this here for a few weeks during one summer, and just something about, you know, this is a center of gravity for me. Even fabulous New York isn't talking to me the way the landscape, the socialism, the kind of the sort of sense of community and connection, and just fantastic quality of life, all sorts of visual and gut things. So I kind of fell in love with Scotland and made it possible. I wouldn't say it was wild, I fell in love specifically with specific women, but reconnected, you know, connected with what was obviously there. And so when I first came to Scotland, gradually, as you do, if you're interested in the place, friends who know how to drive, or if you know how the bus routes are, take you to good places. So I began to sort of discover, you know, things like the nearby islands, like Arran, and which I was living in Glasgow. I'd been in Edinburgh and then was over in Glasgow for a while. So, but it was also, and realized as I was traveling around, one of the books that were coming with me were books like Kate Millett, Sexual Politics, and they were books that were, the conversation had started. And so I was sort of reading, I thought, oh, I think I'm figuring out who I am here, sitting on various beaches. And I realized there were points where I'd said, it happened on a beach in Arran. And then I also went off when I was already thinking, oh, I've really got to get my head around stuff, kind of taking what were then post buses around, where you could get a ferry out to various islands, and then the postie van that traveled around the islands also was like a little tiny minibus, and that was public transport. And I have never driven, I couldn't drive then, and you know, but it was also, I do things like hitchhiking. Oh, my New Jersey mother would have gone nuts. But, she did go nuts when I told her about it much later. But, you know, and you could just moving around the islands for a few weeks, and by the time I got up to, you know, I started down because it was a straight arrow trip from Oban to Barra, and then worked my way up through what is called the Long Island, which is the group of islands. I'm probably telling people here who come from there, I don't know. But, you know, that moving up through those islands, and, you know, doing a lot of reading and a lot of just talking to people, and a lot of just wandering in the landscape, listening, feeling the sound and the space of it. And I'd never been somebody who was comfortable out in landscape in the States, but somehow the Scottish landscape, I felt, you know, I've only bagged one Munro in all these years. You know, there is something that just, I sort of looked at the place and there's something about the rocks and the light and everything. And then when I was wandering around Barra, there was one point where there was a lochan, a small loch, and an artist who lived there. I don't know I think she was of a local family. I don't know what her story was. I just knew that she was there. Had done some sort of landscape sculpture out. It was sitting on a little islet in the middle of the Lochan. And I was really knocked out. I thought, that is so interesting and so cool. So went away and then continued my travels. And by the time I got back to the mainland and took the ferry over to Ewing and Skye, and then another ferry and the bus in between, and then the long, long bus down to Glasgow. I thought, okay, maybe, okay, I'm not even bisexual, I think I'm just a lesbian. And I could see, this is maybe the country I want to be in forever. And in spite of the fact, my ethnic roots, there's nothing Scottish about it. I mean, I come from Eastern European Jewish stock, so Scotland was a place where maybe some people on the journey to America stopped to change ships, but that was the only real link with it. And so anyway, so that's does that give you, so I think that it was the islands and it was the landscape and it was just the sense of place and the colour blue and all the things that get Scotland under your skin, and at the same time were letting me get in touch with what was deeper inside.
Can I say that that's really interesting, because that's so much like Maria, the journey, even that she goes on the long journey instead of flying and doing all of that she goes, and yeah, I can see that so much now in what you've written in the book.
Anyway, so long story for a long shortcut.
Well, Rachel, I hope you can tell a long story too about what about Scottish folklore made you feel that it would be suitable for poems aimed at queer young people. Is there something about it, well, first of all, that appealed to you yourself, but second of all, that made you feel that it would appeal to young people, especially young people who felt they were different?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that when I first met you, Sigrid, I was talking about this, about writing Wayne and why, and part of it was that my daughter loves the Scottish folklore, and I do a lot of storytelling, and I do a lot of storytelling for Audrey, my daughter, and she especially likes the Scottish stuff, as I told you then, because a lot of it's quite dark and kind of gnarly, and she loves that. She loves like a kind of quite horrific creature, and her favourite are the Kelpies, which like literally drown children, but she just can't get enough of it. And so I think I had a lot in my mind from that and from telling her stories, and when I would tell stories to her or even read books to her, any children's books, often I would gender swap a lot of the characters, because there weren't any books that were about families like ours or people like us or like our friends and the people we knew, and it just painted this like weird empty world, almost the normal ones where we were missing. And the books that you could find that were for children, and I think there are some really good ones, and if you look for them now especially you can find them, but sort of a while back when I was doing this, the books that you could find for children that had LGBT stuff in were like a how-to kind of explanation for like a child who it's supposed is straight and cis and from a straight cis family and has never encountered the concepts before, and it's like this is little Helen who has 2 mummies, and it's okay that she has 2 mummies and you mustn't bully her, and that just was meaningless to Audrey. and it's like great that those books exist obviously, but it wasn't what we were looking for. So I started gender swapping these stories, and so that's where it first came about, was writing for her, and then as I got more into it as well, I was writing a lot for myself when I was younger. Sort of imagined when I was at school, I think like a lot of people can maybe relate to who are a bit different when they're younger, I didn't have many friends, I didn't let a lot of people very close to me at all, and I sort of escaped into literature and read a lot. But even there was like no one liked me. What you said about like not even really knowing the word lesbian, well, like we knew it, but it was an insult in the playground. It was like what you got called, and it was the thing you definitely didn't want to be. So, and I remember just thinking like, this is something monstrous that nobody can ever know, that I have to keep hidden for the rest of my life. And I think there's something in that, in stories like, say for example, the Selkie, who is married to the man, but actually her sealskin is still in the back of the cupboard. It's that secret there in the closet. And one day it's going to come out and she's going to go back to the sea. And I think there's something in that we can relate to, this thing where, the normal people are going to find us monstrous if they know this secret thing about us that's not like them. And so I think that's also what drew me to Scottish folklore.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the Selkie. You made some of the songs we were playing before the reading. There's one of them that's by Joan Baez, and it's The Great Selkie of Soulskerry, and I can hardly ever hear it without feeling sort of chilled in the back of my neck, because everybody is so completely resigned and calm about the fact that they have these terrible fates, and instead of bemoaning them, they step into them.
I sort of felt after a working life spent churning out hundreds and thousands of non-fiction words, because I work for one of these big multinational publishers as my day job, Time Life, where you would do 28 volumes on world mythology, say, or 28 volumes on, the Cold War or the Renaissance or archaeology or whatever, where I can turn my hand to taking any boring technical but authoritative prose on anything and turn it into something that could be accessible to most people. I sort of felt after the 4 novels, I began to feel I was kind of written out and was just worded out. I felt there are an awful lot of interesting words coming from a lot of places, and I don't necessarily, I feel, okay, I've done, can I do any more? Do I have the energy, the inspiration, the time, the whatever? And then found that I was just kind of getting a bit off long form. So after doing just a very, very short kind of online essay thing that I'd published on looking at the Yiddish that was used in my family, in an immigrant, a family that it was a 3rd generation of immigration where they'd come as Yiddish speakers, but and when my grandmother was a baby, she was probably came very, she was born in America, but, so you had a family that arrived speaking Yiddish. She spoke, and her children could use Yiddish expressions, and I could only use Yiddish words, but I was going back to study Yiddish. And so reconnecting with which my ancestral language, and also just began to go back to another old love, which was poetry, which I had kind of lost. I started writing poetry before I could write. I would sort of dictate little poems to my parents when I was about 3, apparently. There's one piece of paper, I think, still in a file somewhere. But the notion of kind of long form writing, somehow, I just felt kind of drained. And found I wasn't even reading much fiction. But I'd started reading poetry again, and for a long time I just didn't get a lot of poetry. Sorry about that. I just could look at it and say, I don't see what the fuss is here, or I'm just not finding anybody that speaks to me. And suddenly, kapow, I was. And so I kind of become almost a kind of, in some ways, quite a sort of tentative beginner in some ways, although I've now had various poems individually published or used to turn into lyrics for a band that wanted to, for a particular Yiddish poem I'd written, because I thought that was one way if you're trying to learn a language that you sort of know bits of, is write poetry in it. I mean, that's real masochism, but anyway. So I started playing around with Yiddish poetry, and then I also realized, okay, I may not speak, I'm too old to really learn a language properly anymore, but, you can kind of learn it enough. But I no longer felt, I feel suddenly the English language poetry started coming out, so I've been doing some of that, and I've had a few either things published, but sometimes people sort of ask me, like, oh, we've heard a reading you've given as part of some Jewish cultural lefty event, could we print that, or something like that. But I haven't, so in terms of what's next, I suppose, the next sort of thing I have any sort of deadline-y thing for is just somebody who's another Scottish Jewish poet who's also playing around with Yiddish and Scots. We're doing a little thing in Push the Boat Out, which is a poetry festival in Edinburgh that takes place at Summer Hall in the autumn. And so I think, as well as having probably enough of a fistful of old poems, I will probably want to write a few new ones as well. But I just, at this stage, I sort of think, if I don't write anything ever and again, I can't imagine not doing that, but at the same time, I can't even get through the books I want to read. And so I think probably the time is running out in terms of books I might want to write. But I'm not sure if I would go back to long form into a novel. I just think, among other things, as you get older, you sort of don't have the time. Not much less, not to mention the fact that sometimes even a poem takes 6 months before somebody says, yes, you can or can't put it in our lovely annual or semi-annual literary magazine. Yeah.
I'm so excited about the poetry.
For anyone who hasn't read The Fires of Bride, there are 2 very strong female figures in it. One is Katrina. She's an aristocrat, she's a doctor, she's right out there front and center, and she's also maybe not somebody it would always be very nice to meet, let alone to have a hot love affair with. And the other character is called Maria. She's an artist and a metal worker, and she has flaming red hair. she's the one who comes to the island from elsewhere, and is the one we see the island through her eyes. She at first she's been going through a bad period, and she doesn't feel like she can create anything. But then all the life on the island, let alone falling in love with Katrina, and then and that not always working out quite straightforwardly, she starts to develop and become more of a fighting woman. And there's something about these two characters that suggests they're not completely human beings like you and me. There are lots of hints in the book about where legends maybe fade into reality. But one of the wonderful things about the book is that it doesn't spell any of that out. You have to look. And I wondered if I could get you to give your hand away a little bit or not. You don't have to.
Well, I probably would, the answer might change at different times. That's what I would say. Well, certainly, Catriona and the Cailleach probably have a certain amount of shared DNA. I think Maria, well, I mean, there are odd sort of time jumps and things, but Maria, if she has any, what she probably relates to when I was wandering around Barra in the, what was that, summer of 77, I think, or 76, 77, and saw this sculpture rising, this metal sculpture rising out of the loch, and also this thing about the overlaps of metalwork, and just that notion of imagination and using materials, and whether those materials are language or memory or myth or lust, and how that kind of comes together. So, but she's not. I wouldn't say either of them are what you might call sort of allegorical. I was never very good at psychological realism, that sort of, but she's. I think they both connect, and there are points in the book where they connect with earlier periods of history on the island as well.
There's a lot of earlier periods of history woven into the plot, and you're never quite sure exactly how far back something is going. But I also should say, since Ellen isn't going to do a commercial for her novel, but that there's a lot more to it than that. There are a lot of very ordinary characters. Some of them are comic. There's an American entrepreneur who comes to the island trying to and starts a factory that creates artifacts, and there's an archaeologist called Stoney who's a rival for Katrina's affections, and there's Ina Isbister, the bed and breakfast lady, and it's like all of Ellen's novels. It's a comedy and a fantasy.
Once upon a time in New York, I wanted to, there was a particularly very cool party that I wanted to go to, and I had never, I'm not really good at putting on lipstick and I sort of stuff. As soon as you're allowed to, you try it for about 5 minutes and and then after that I didn't. But this lovely person who was called Bobby Chief, who was as tough as they come, kind of a kind of a many lives all at once, who was a friend of a very close friend, and said, I'll fix you, I'll show you how to put makeup on, dear. And it was, what a waste of opportunity. I mean, it was like Picasso trying to teach a doodler how to kind of do a stick figure or how to do a portrait. And because Bobby, rest their soul, would have said, listen, when I'm in full gear, I could walk down the street and you wouldn't even know it was me. Absolutely, an artist of transformation. So, I think there were some tributes in there probably, but I've never been into the Romana clay, this has got to be a disguised version of so-and-so, although I could have gotten probably, not quite sued, but the early scenes in what Tally Telly, which bore a degree of resemblance to Scottish television in those days, which was this job I had. There is certainly one character in there who various people said, I see you got, down. Amazing. Of your characters, can I ask, who probably haunted your dreams and your imagination rather than actually your workplaces. Who would, if Desert Island disc question, who would you like to be up in a tiny islet somewhere without a causeway, the other side of Barra? Who would you like to hang out with of those people?
From the folk, they're all really good. And okay, there's this, the answer is kind of a collective, they kind of come as a group, and it's the 7 big women of Jura, because they are only mentioned like in passing in much of the folklore stories. Like they're just sort of known to be these 7 giantesses who live on, like, you don't want to go to Jura, it's got 7 big women, they're angry, and then it's always like your hero has to go and like steal something from the set, and they're like, oh, but the big women, oh, I know, but I've got to go get it, and then so then they just manage to escape and not be like eaten or whatever by the 7 big women, and I was like, oh, I want to know everything about these 7 big women, so I imagine them as this like lesbian polyamorous commune, and they're who I would like to go and live with.
Wow. I think this, whoever is the Jura tourist office really ought to be making use of that.
Oh, exactly.
I'd go in a minute.
Right. Sorry, that went places, but
I'd like to see the poster design.
yeah, that's it.
I'd like to see the cookbook they write.
Amazing.
The 7 Big Women of Jura cookbook. You will get it.
Mashed hero.
I was very, very interested from reading things like The Golden Bough as a kid, your collections of folklore, the notion of archetypes, when you're, that was big back in the Stone Age when I was an undergraduate. There was, it was a very fashionable archetypal criticism where, things were, you had replications of, in different cultures of different types of things, like the sacrificial cycle of a kingship, which I always think in the American presidential elections, there's some deep resonance there. I'd personally be very happy to do a little bit of this sacrificing a few last time around, if anybody gives me the chance. But
do it.
No, I'm a good girl. but it was a subject I was always interested in, cultural anthropology and those connections. And I think also, one of the things about coming out of a Jewish culture, it's a very problematical place to come from and to be in and to grow up and everything. But the notions of time and connection and that the fascination with deep time and with the past and the connections between things and the connections between forces of nature and as people's definitions of God or no God or what happened in the universe or the universes, all of those things, they were sort of just beginning to kind of blow up into possibility out of this sort of rigidities. I think I talked about that earlier. And so I got really interested in this. So I was reading always a lot about folklore. And then there was a period in late 70s, early 80s when there was a lot of academic writing about goddesses, about goddess traditions. Some of it very academic, some of it pop intellectual kind of, there were people like Merlin Stone, who anthology pieces of different goddesses and giving you sort of catalogs almost of who's related to whom. There was a woman who was very, very, she was a serious academic. Her stuff was very much debunked, and now it seems to be a revival. I think she was a Lithuanian originally, Maria Gimbutas. Big coffee table size art book, but looking at the tradition of the goddess. Because when you're trying to reclaim notions of power, back then, some of it, you sort of cringe at the sort of the bad lyrics of certain groups like, Alex Dawkins' band. Oh, those lyrics, oh, that awful music. But there was that notion, that empowering notion that, it was not just what you had been handed to as a little kid, in the various churches, synagogues, different sects, different denominations that populated and dominated the communities that some of us grew up in. And so, the notion that, there's a different way to look at creativity, creation, love, cattle, sacrifice, repentance, all those things, just suddenly alternatives were starting to come through. And so I guess I was really, really interested in that subject long before I was old enough to probably spell iconography.
I'm just literally an enthusiastic amateur. I'm not any kind of great scholar of folklore. I just really like stories, and I do a lot of storytelling, as I mentioned. I've lived in Scotland since my late teens, and so I have like a lot of Scottish folklore around me, and like I said, I would tell a lot of Scottish stories, and a lot of it came from that. But also I just read a lot, like you said, a lot of things. Like, you can go to the Storytelling Centre and look at their stuff. They've got amazing quantities of every kind of book and event and stuff, and listen to the stories. So, and I even said, I've written in the back of Wayne, because I was like, people are going to come and say like, you've got this wrong or that, because there's so many different versions and interpretations. So I just literally wrote in the back, it's not meant to be a definitive one, it's just inspired by these different stories. But I think it's really important to remember that that's what folklore is. There's no one definitive version of any of the stories, and they're told and retold by people, and they kind of belong to all of us. And that's really important to me, because when people were coming and saying like, how dare you make this folklore queer, I'd be like, well, how dare you make it straight, because it was definitely queer at some point. So that's what it's for. It's not meant to be like some copyrighted thing, like you said, not some kind of canon, but something that was meant to be used. It was kind of a tool, so it was used to explain things and talk about things, and so each community has made it their own.
As the lights go